I explained to you last time that the Bhagavad Gita consistently throughout from the beginning right up till the end keeps describing that state of altered consciousness where the individual seeker is situated on the platform of spirit. So he is seated in divine consciousness, whether he is the Stitha Prajna, whether he is a karma yogi, whether he is a dhyan yogi, whether he is a, shall we say, a bhakta, whether he is a gunatita. In all circumstances, Krishna gives descriptions of the sage who has transcended the world, even while he works actively within it. And this sage who is working within the world, although he is transcendent to it, is situated in a special state of consciousness. And this is described at various places. So in this series, I'm trying to describe all of them one by one, because essentially the Bhagavad Gita deals with different topics that are spread through the 18 chapters. And only when you thread the subjects together by picking them up from each chapter are you able to get a coherent image of what Krishna is trying to say. So last time I began to discuss the subject of Stitha Prajna, the sage of steady wisdom. The sage whose wisdom is steady because his consciousness is not disturbed by the provocation of reactive emotion. So one who has transcended emotion, whose intelligence is steady, that person is called a sage of steady wisdom. It's also implied that he is gunatita, that is, he is beyond the gunas, that in fact he is jivan mukta, which means that he is attained salvation even while he is within this body. And he is what we know as Brahma Bhuta, which is he is situated on the platform of spirit. So last time, Krishna explained, we did the verses where Krishna explained that how it is that we fall into complete material consciousness and lead to confusion and result in despair. So it starts with a thought, that thought becomes an attachment, that attachment becomes a lust or desire. When that is obstructed by anyone in the world, that lust or desire becomes anger. That anger leads to delusion. When that delusion occurs, then one loses all awareness or even remembrance of, loses all memory of laws of the land, laws of God. And therefore, when you become forgetful of God's laws and the laws of the land, then you engage in actions that lead to your complete destruction. So that is what we completed last time. And now we continue from there, because Krishna is explaining that the key to preventing that fall into material consciousness is to control the senses. To control the senses, to become free from both likes and dislikes, to have full control over one's mind and senses, and then one attains the mercy of God. Raga dvesha vimuktestu vishayan indriyascharan atma vashyar videyatma prasadam adi gacchati. So raga dvesha, So likes and dislikes, attachment and detachment. One who is free from these opposites, vimuktestu, such a person who is Vishayan Indriyas Charan. So while he is acting within the world, his senses are so controlled that they do not run towards the sense objects. And having controlled his mind and senses, such a person attains the grace of God. Prasadam adi gacchati. In the Kathopanishad, classically, this is given in a very wonderful metaphor. So in the Kathopanishad, it is described that Atmanam Rathinam Vidhi, Shariram Ratham Evatu, Buddhim tu Saradam Vidhi Manaha Pragraham Evacha. Your body is the chariot of the soul. Your intelligence is the charioteer. Your mind are the reins, and the horses are your senses. I'm repeating it so that you can fix it in your mind. Your body is the chariot of your soul. Your intelligence is your charioteer. Your mind are the reins that the charioteer holds, and the horses are the senses. Then he goes on to say that one whose intelligence is divinely guided, one whose mind is restrained, one whose senses are controlled, such a person goes to divinity. Such a person goes to Paramam Padam. Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam. So, everything Krishna explains about Stitha Prajna here is based on this. So in this Stitha Prajna section of the Bhagavad Gita, where he first introduces us to the idea of the sage of steady wisdom, he is explaining that if you can control your mind and your senses, if your intelligence can be divinely guided, then he says, you will move towards the supreme destination, Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam. In the world, there are two types of people. Those people whose not only whose senses are completely restrained, but who live for the pleasures of the senses alone. They live only for the pleasures of the senses. There was a sage who went to the United Kingdom many years back, maybe 40, 50, 60 years back. And when he went to the United Kingdom, he met the elite of English society. He met several lords and ladies. So one lord asked him, what do I have to do to practice all this? So he says, you have to restrain your senses. So he said, what do you mean by that? So the sage said that to start with, you should give up meat eating, illicit sex, intoxication, gambling. So you give up eating products of violence, stop taking alcohol and other intoxicants, stop gambling, and stop having illicit sexual activity. This is the beginning of controlling your senses. So that fellow says, how can I give that up? That is what I am. These four things are the things that I'm living for. This is the purpose of my life. How can you ask me to give it up? So there are people who live for the pleasures of the senses. Then there are people who realize that the body is the chariot of the soul, the intelligence is the charioteer, the mind are the reins, and the senses are the horses. And one whose intelligence is divinely guided and controlled, such a person moves on towards Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam. because the mind will be restrained, the horses will be controlled, senses will be controlled. And such a man in that consciousness, divine consciousness of Stitha Prajna, such a person moves towards divinity. So having explained this, you should realize that even at that time, there were people who had a whole philosophy of enjoyment. They were called the Charvakas. And these Charvakas had their own philosophy. Yavat jivet sukhat jivet rinam kritva ghritam pibet bhasmi bhutasya dehasya punarjanama kuta bhavet. Says, while you are living, he says, enjoy. He gives a metaphor there. He says, drink ghee. So drink ghee, which is a metaphor for enjoying to the hilt. Yavat jivet sukhat jivet. As long as you're living, try to enjoy the pleasures of the senses and be happy through the senses. Rinam kritva. Take a loan. Take a loan. And ghritam pibet. Indulge fully. Do you get phone calls which tell you that, sir, we are offering you a loan, personal loan. We are offering you a consumer loan. So this is the philosophy of Charvakas. Enjoy now and pay later. Because he says, Bhasmi bhutasya dehasya, he says, your body eventually, when you pass away, will be burnt into ashes. Who knows if there's another life? So that is one school of philosophy. The other school of philosophy is also very clear. That if you can divinely guide your intelligence, if you can restrain your senses, if you can, thus through control of the mind and senses and an intelligence guided by divinity and divine knowledge, you will move gradually towards divinity. So what is this divinity? What do we mean by this divinity? How will we know that we are coming close to divine consciousness? So in that, Krishna explains that when you are situated in divine consciousness, you will become free from suffering. So I've repeated this before, but I'm saying it again. This world, Krishna says, is a dukh alayam ashashvatam. It is a place of misery where everything is temporary. This is an anityam, asukham lokam. This is a place where there is no happiness, and you cannot find lasting happiness here because everything is temporary. It's a anityam, asukham lokam. No permanence and no happiness. And Krishna says again, Janma, Mrityu, Jara, Vyadhi, Dukkha, Doshanu, Darshanam. Birth, death, old age, disease, fault, misfortune, and happiness. All this, he says, is guaranteed to you. The Buddha also said this much later, because Buddha came much later. And he also said that spiritual life cannot begin until you realize that the essence of life is suffering. For birth is suffering, death is suffering, old age is suffering, disease is suffering. To be parted from someone you love is suffering. To be forced to bear the presence of someone you cannot tolerate, that is also suffering. Now, the beauty of Stitha Prajna is that he rises beyond suffering. What are the kinds of suffering that one has? Suffering in this world is divided into three varieties, symbolized by the Trishul, which you will see carried by the goddess. The Trishul stands for Adhyatmik, Adi Bhautik, and Adi Daivik. So your sufferings first are the sufferings that are caused by your own body and mind. So all the stress you experience, all the sorrows and depression you experience, all the anxiety you experience, and the more serious mental disorders that one experiences, all of these are adhyatmic sufferings that you experience. Your body falls ill, your body becomes diseased as you grow old, your organs begin to fail, your senses become weaker. All this is also your adhyatmic diseases and adhyatmic miseries. It's the suffering that comes from adhyatma. Adi Bhautik means miseries caused by other people. So if you are suffering because you have a bad boss, that is Adi Bhautik. If you are suffering because you are being troubled by your mother-in-law, that is also Adi Bhautik. And then, besides other human beings, you are also suffering because of the elements which are controlled by the Devatas. So when you go and you leave the house without an umbrella and you're caught in the rain, that is called Adi Daivik misery. Similarly, if there's an earthquake, that's Adi Daivik miseries. If you're suffering from heat and cold and rain, storm, if you're suffering from a tsunami, if you're suffering from flooding, all of this is Adi Daivik misery. So Krishna is explaining that if you control your senses, by control of the senses, you will get the grace of God and your intelligence will become steady. How will your intelligence become steady? He says this, prasade sarve dukkhanam hanirasya pajayate prasanna chetaso hi ashu buddhir paryavitastate. So one who is situated in divine consciousness, misery in the world no longer exists. In this state of consciousness, your intelligence becomes steady. When you are not suffering, when your mind is not agitated, your intelligence becomes steady. And when your intelligence becomes steady, then you are qualified to move towards peace, because peace will give you steadiness of mind and intelligence. And only when you are in peace, you can have happiness. Because indeed, there are many people, you must have noticed, while going for a job interview or going for a examination, everybody is so tense over there and somebody makes some silly remark and everyone begins to laugh. Is that happiness? My friends, that is not happiness, that is hysteria. Because everybody is in such a high state of tension that any stupid remark will make people start laughing as a release from the tension. You cannot have happiness unless you have peace. So Krishna says, Nasti buddhira yuktasya, na cha yuktasya bhavana, na chabhya vyatahi shantir, ashantasya kuto sukham. So if you are not in transcendental consciousness, if you don't have a controlled mind or steady intelligence, how can you have peace? And unless you have happiness, unless you have peace, how can you have happiness? Ashantasya kuto sukham. This is very, very important. And don't think that you can control some of the senses and some of the senses are not under your control. Just as a boat is swept away by a strong wind, Krishna says, even one of the senses which you let loose will carry away your intelligence. Therefore, Krishna says that one whose senses are controlled, such a person is a Stitha Prajna. This is very important. Tasmad yasya mahabhao nigritani sarvashah indriyani indriyarthebhyas tasya pragna pratishtitah. So one whose senses are controlled, such a person is of steady intelligence. Incidentally, you might want to know, because being a person who is a doctor, a surgeon, and having an interest in neuroscience, I have studied many books that deal with altered states of consciousness. And there are three things which consistently bring about an altered state of consciousness. One of them is sensorial deprivation, which is what is stressed here in Stitha Prajna. If you restrain your senses, then restrainment of senses automatically will give you tremendous peace. Whereas if you think that you can enjoy through your senses when you're disturbed, you will become even more disturbed. Similarly, like sensorial deprivation, the other is social isolation. If you think going for parties and enjoying and meeting more and more people will alleviate your suffering, sorry. What will happen is when you isolate yourself socially, then your mind will become calmer. And the third, which is consistently known to bring you into an altered state of consciousness, is if you can restrict your caloric intake, if you can restrict the food that you're taking, that also calms and quietens your senses. Some of you, if you have gone for Vipassana at Igatpuri or other places, you will have noticed that they use all three. First of all, your phone is taken away, all your reading, writing materials are taken away, so that you are completely drained sensorially. You are not allowed to signal or communicate with anybody, even someone who's sharing your room. And not only that, but they will feed you only at midday and breakfast. After that, you have to fast. So all these three, which is sensorial deprivation, caloric restriction, social isolation, will bring you into an altered state of consciousness. Even the Upanishads have described that mana eva manushyanam karanam bandha mokshayo bandhai vishaya sangim muktai nirvishayam smritam. So the mind is the cause of bondage and the mind is the cause of your salvation. One whose mind is attached to the objects of the senses, such a person is in bondage. One whose mind is free of all thoughts of the objects of the senses, such a person is actually liberated. So Krishna explains that you need to control the senses, you need to restrain the mind, you need to quieten the intelligence by giving it divine knowledge. And as a result of that, your wisdom becomes manifest. So, very much in brief, he says that a person is not, this Stitha Prajna is not disturbed when there are objects of enjoyment placed before him. If he comes to your house and you give him delicious food, he will not refuse it. But if you keep him hungry, even though it's past mealtime, you give him nothing to eat or drink, even then he will not say anything. So they say that the sage of steady wisdom is like the ocean. The ocean never refuses the rivers that are rushing into it during the monsoon in flood. But in the summer heat, when the rivers have dried up and none of the rivers are flowing into the sea, does the sea get disturbed? Does the sea become less full? The sea remains full. So also, the sage of steady wisdom is one who, like the ocean, is always full. You give him something to eat, he will enjoy it. If you don't give him, he is still happy in himself. So Krishna says at the conclusion of Stitha Prajna, that when you give up all desires for enjoying the world through the senses, when you give up all your desires, when you have lost your ego, your sense of I, me, myself, mine, only then you can get real peace. Vihai kaman yah sarvan pumaus charati nishpriha nirmamo nirahankara sa shantim adigacchati. Vihai kaman yah sarvan. Give up all desires for enjoying the things of the world through your senses. Live desirelessly. Pumaus charati nispraha. Nirmamo nirahankara. No I, me and mine. Forget about your ego and your sense of self. Then you will get perfect peace. Sa shantim adigacchati. And thus Krishna says, if you attain this state of consciousness of the Stitha Prajna, then even at the time of death, you will be undisturbed and you will enter into the kingdom of God. So I will pause here now. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Yes, Dr. Shantanu. Hi, good morning. Dr. Shantanu, you've mentioned, different kinds of things that one must do to reach a state of divine consciousness. To kind of reach that state, one has to control one's mind. So, what is really the basic steps to controlling one's mind? Where should one really start off with?
Everything that increases your sense of self, because the sense of self is a root of the mind. It is a root and the seed of the mind. So the sense of self must be diminished. The best way to do that is to remember God and forget self. And the best two ways to remember God and forget self is to offer everything to God. All your work, all your duties, everything you do, you offer to Him. And the other is that when you are not gainfully occupied in your profession or your work, then chant. And by chanting, you will silence your mind. Very good. You can see the example of Krishna and Kaliya, not just as a pastime of Lord Krishna, which it is, but if you want, you can look at it also as a metaphor. Because Kaliya the snake is none other than your mind, which is strong in the sense of I, me, myself. And when you chant the name of God, when you chant Krishna's name, Krishna dances on your tongue, but actually Krishna is dancing on your mind. He is dancing on Kaliya, your uncontrolled mind. And thus, he brings out all the poison from your mind, all the poison from your ego, all the poison from the emotional baggage you have stored in the past, and purifies you. And then from the narrow confines of your little pond or river, he leads you into the ocean where you can be of service to humanity. Any other questions?
Dr. Shantanu, also, you spoke about the different kinds of suffering, one's own self, physical suffering, nature calamity, and things like that. So, if it's a suffering, I mean, in the sense, if it's a physical suffering, then how does one not get affected? If it's suppose it's a pain in the body, it's causing discomfort, it's causing suffering. So, how does one not get affected?
See, first of all, I'd like to tell you that when you are situated in a divine state of consciousness, without thought of self, the suffering goes away. Only the pain remains.
Right.
So there's a difference between pain and suffering.
Hmm.
When you are having pain, pain is pain. But your suffering, you bring on yourself. Arey, why did this happen to me? Look what my neighbor is doing. They're enjoying. I am suffering. How come I got all this problem? So you start suffering because your mind brings greater aggravation to your existing pain. So when the mind is silent, suffering is cut out. So pain is unavoidable. Some pain is unavoidable, but suffering is always an option. So you can become free from suffering. Secondly, even pain becomes diminished when you are not that centered on your body. The more you are centered on your body, the more pain you will experience. The less you are centered on your body, the less pain also you will experience on a pain scale. So what really happens is that the pain is there. It's not that it's not there. But your experience of that pain is not the same as if you are very body conscious and mere ko kya ho raha hai, then you will be in great trouble. I have personally experienced as a surgeon operating on sages who are in divine consciousness. And I have operated major surgeries under local anesthesias where the pain was incredible for anybody else, but where the sage was able to tolerate. And when I asked him, did it pain you? He said, of course it pained me. So I asked him, why did you not complain? So he said, Bhagavad Gita is about understanding you're not the body. And to the extent you realize you're not the body, to that extent, you will not suffer the pains of the body. So, similarly, we have examples of Raman Maharishi, who had a 4-quarter amputation, not only his upper limb, but also his shoulder blade, and everything was removed. And while I was a very young child at that time, my friend's father operated on him, one of the 3 surgeons who operated on him. And there also it was done under just bare local anesthesia. And Raman Maharishi just went into a trance and just let them operate on him. So I've seen this on multiple occasions. And while, of course, suffering is reduced, even pain, I can tell you, is definitely diminished when you are in divine consciousness. I hope that's clear.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu. These are the questions we had for this week. We've still got some time. So if you want to talk about the next session or what you will be picking up, please go ahead.
So, well, the next session I will explain the state of a person who is engaged in Karma Yoga. And that is a primary form of spiritual deliverance that Krishna describes. And it's one that comes naturally to all of us because all of us are working. If we are not working in office or we are not working in the world, at least we are working in our home. And thus, by working and doing that work in a spirit of offering and sacrifice to God, without any sense of I, me, and myself, all of us can experience that state. So, the same description of how one rises beyond all this is explained later in the Bhagavad Gita, which I will discuss. And then go on to state of the Dhyan Yogi.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu. And we look forward to the next week.
No one has any questions, right?
We don't have any more questions right now, but if they come, I'll send them to you, or you can see the Facebook comments and answer them there.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu.